Welcome to Cafe Tales, a cozy corner for mystery lovers where Agatha Christie-inspired stories come alive. Today, I've brought you a brand new tale filled with secrets, suspense, and the classic charm of timeless detective work. Before we begin, I would love to know a little about you. Where in the world are you listening from, and how has your day been so far? Share your thoughts down in the comments. It is always a joy to see this community connect through stories. If you enjoy the mystery you are about to hear, make sure to subscribe and become part of our Cafe Tales family. New stories await you here, perfect for unwinding at night or escaping into a world of intrigue. Now let us step quietly into today's mystery. Chapter 1. A Whisper. Over tea, it was on one of those mild afternoons in early September, when the air in St. Mary Mead seems to hold the very last of summer's gentleness, that Miss Jane Marple found herself at her accustomed corner table in the Bluebird tea rooms. The china cups clinked softly, a clock ticked unobtrusively near the counter, and the smell of warm scones liberally buttered lent the room its usual sense of comfort and civility. Miss Marple was knitting, of course plain, serviceable stitches in pale blue wool, while her eyes, shrewd and deceptively mild, wandered unobtrusively over the scene. She enjoyed the tea room, for it was a place where the little eddies of village life often converged. The tradesmen's wives stopped here on their errands. The doctor's sister sometimes lingered for a slice of seed cake. And, best of all, the conversations carried just enough of curiosity and candour to provide an attentive listener with a steady supply of human nature. It was from the table behind her, where two ladies sat whispering over cups of Darjeeling, that the remark first came. "My dear," said the first, in a voice too intent to be mere casual gossip. It was positively indecorous. Lydia Harcourt, at her age, meeting a young man by the churchyard gate after dusk.
"I saw it with my very own eyes." Her companion gave a soft gasp, the kind intended to sound shocked, but tinged with relish.
"Surely not, Clara? Mrs. Harcourt is a married woman, and with such standing in the parish. Why, she organises the harvest sale every year." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently, but her ears, ever so delicately tuned, caught every syllable. She did not so much as glance round, for she knew well enough that information volunteered freely was far more valuable than that dragged out by questioning. Clara leaned forward, lowering her voice, though not her eagerness.
"I tell you she was there."
"I was bringing home a jar of honey from Mrs. Dawkins, and I happened to pass by the church. There they stood, half in the shadows, whispering like conspirators. A tall fellow he was, handsome, with dark hair."
"And Lydia, well, she was smiling." There was a pause, then the companion sniffed delicately.
"A smile can mean many things, Clara. Perhaps he was a cousin. Cousin or not, it had the look of something not quite proper." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. She had seen Lydia Harcourt often enough, a graceful woman still in her prime, married to John Harcourt, a man of consequence, though known for his temper. What interested Miss Marple more than the content of the gossip was the faint, tremulous note in Clara's voice, a shade too insistent, too anxious. Gossip was one thing, fear was another. When the ladies departed, leaving crumbs and a faint trace of violet scent behind them, Miss Marple finished her tea and slowly gathered her things. She stepped out into the high street, where the afternoon sun slanted across the cobbles. Children darted with hoops, a farmer's cart rattled by, and there, just outside the greengrocer's, she encountered Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife. "My dear Miss Marple," said Mrs. Calthrop, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles, "you do look the picture of serenity. I always envy you your calmness." "Knitting helps," Miss Marple replied, smiling. "I find it keeps one's hands busy while the mind is free to observe." Mrs. Calthrop laughed, but then her tone changed, softening into a confidential murmur. "I must say there's been a certain uneasiness in the Harcourt household lately. John has been, shall we say, unusually short-tempered. Lydia does her best to cover it, of course, but one cannot mistake the strain. Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. Indeed, that is unfortunate, the vicar's wife sighed. I only hope it is no more than business worries. You know how men can be when their affairs, financial, do not go as smoothly as they might. Miss Marple made a sympathetic sound, though her mind was already weaving the two scraps of conversation together. Lydia Harcourt's twilight meetings and her husband's increasing irritability. Such combinations were rarely accidental. It was later, as Miss Marple proceeded along the high street toward her cottage, that her attention was caught by a small, hurried figure. Lydia Harcourt's maid, little Ellen, with fair curls tucked beneath her cap, was hurrying along, a sealed envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She looked over her shoulder once, twice, as though fearing pursuit. Miss Marple paused by the haberdasher's window, examining ribbons she had no need of, and observed. The girl slipped into the post office with such haste that she nearly collided with a passing gentleman. A moment later, she emerged, empty-handed but still anxious, and scurried back toward the Harcourt's house. Miss Marple's needles, though currently tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. A sealed letter delivered with such haste always bore consideration. One wondered, a message of affection or something far less innocent? That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, the kettle steaming softly, and allowed her mind to turn over the day's small curiosities. She thought of Clara's anxious insistence, of Mrs. Calthrop's gentle warning, of Ellen's furtive errand. Gossip, in her long experience, was rarely baseless. It often came embroidered with exaggeration, trimmed with invention, but beneath it there was generally some fragment of truth. And when gossip coincided with observable fact, the maid's nervousness, the vicar's wife's unease, one was wise to listen carefully. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Human nature, she reflected, was a tapestry of small motives: love, jealousy, money, pride. To see the pattern, one had only to notice the stitches others overlooked. The flames flickered, casting shadows across her modest sitting room. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, solemn and measured. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting abandoned on her lap, and Miss Marple, as she stirred her tea, suspected that what others dismissed as idle talk might be the beginning of something far darker. Chapter 2. A Husband's Temper. The Harcourt's garden had always been considered one of the loveliest in St. Mary Mead. On that particular Saturday afternoon, the late roses were still in bloom, and the lawn was dotted with wicker chairs and parasols, giving the whole scene an air of cheerful civility. Trays of sandwiches, neat triangles of cucumber and ham, stood ready, while the maids carried pitchers of lemonade and cups of strong tea between the guests. The occasion was announced as a casual gathering, but in St. Mary Mead such things were rarely casual. They were rather opportunities to measure one's neighbours, to exchange tidbits of information,
And most importantly, to be seen Miss Marple.
Seated comfortably in a shaded corner with her knitting bag beside her, was an unobtrusive part of the tableau. To the casual eye, she seemed a harmless elderly spinster, taking quiet delight in the flowers and the company, yet her eyes, bright and deceptively mild,
Observed every detail, the stiffness in Mr. Harcourt's shoulders,
the faint line of strain about Mrs. Harcourt's smile, the nervous flicker of a maid's glance as she passed a tray. It was Mr. Harcourt himself who first drew the room's attention. He was a man of imposing figure, broad and ruddy, with the kind of hearty manner that could too easily turn to bluster. That day he wore a smile, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. When his wife drifted past him, pausing to greet a guest, he remarked loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Ah, my Lydia, ever the gracious hostess, and, of course, ever the faithful wife." The words were light, but there was a thin edge beneath them. Several of the guests shifted uneasily. Lydia Harcourt, standing very still for the space of a breath, grew pale. Then with a quick laugh she replied, "Why, John, you make me sound quite saintly. I assure you I am nothing of the kind." The moment passed with polite chuckles, yet Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, noted the faint tremor of Lydia's hand as she adjusted the lace at her wrist. It was Colonel Weston, retired and red-faced from both sun and habit, who leaned toward Miss Marple a little later, when the company had settled with sandwiches. "Fine show, eh? Though between you and me, Harcourt's been in a muddle of late. Lost a tidy sum in some foreign scheme, oil wells or shipping, something of the sort. He never did have a head for investments." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic murmur. The Colonel, encouraged, went on, "Course, he puts a brave face on it. But it makes a man short of temper, you know."
And Lydia, well, she's not the sort to thrive under scoldings. Miss Marple's needles paused for a single beat, then resumed their steady rhythm.
She did not comment further, but she tucked the remark away neatly. Money, she had found, was often at the root of far greater dramas than love. The guests mingled, voices rising and falling in pleasant cadences. Miss Hartnell declared that the roses would have been finer had the gardener watered less, and Mrs. Price Ridley whispered to Mrs. Clement that Lydia Harcourt's gown, though undeniably charming, was surely too youthful for a woman of her age. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened without seeming to, as she had so often done before. It was then she noticed Lydia slipping quietly toward the conservatory, her face still composed but her step a little too hurried. 10 minutes passed, perhaps 15, before she reappeared, smiling, and resumed her duties as hostess. Nothing remarkable in that, except that during those minutes, Miss Marple had strolled near the conservatory herself, drawn by the sight of a rare orchid displayed in the window. There, just beneath the trailing blossoms, she had caught the unmistakable scent of cigar smoke, rich, heavy, lingering in the air. Yet Mr. Harcourt, the only man in the household known for cigars, had been visible on the lawn the entire time, laughing somewhat too heartily at one of the vicar's anecdotes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Smoke without a smoker always begged the question of who had been present and why. Later, when the sun began to dip and the guests gathered for a final round of tea, Lydia returned to her husband's side. Her composure was perfect, her laugh easy, yet Miss Marple noticed one small detail. The delicate gloves Lydia had worn earlier, pale cream with embroidered cuffs, were gone. No one else seemed to remark upon it, but Miss Marple, who seldom missed such matters, found it curious. Ladies were not in the habit of misplacing gloves halfway through an afternoon. They were, however, sometimes compelled to remove them, for letters, for tokens, for moments that must leave no trace. As the party wound down, Miss Marple gathered her shawl, thanked Lydia warmly, and allowed herself to be escorted out with the rest. To any who looked, she seemed entirely content, a sweet elderly lady content with her tea and knitting. Yet within her mind the pattern was beginning to stitch itself together. A husband with a temper and money troubles, a wife pale beneath her smile, a whisper of meetings by the churchyard, a cigar's fragrance where no smoker stood, and now a pair of vanished gloves, all small things, yes. But Miss Marple knew that in small things lay the shadow of larger truths. And Miss Marple, adjusting her shawl, felt sure that within that cheerful garden something was already beginning to curdle. Chapter 3. The stranger in the village. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, of course, who first spotted the newcomer. She had been at the grocer's, standing very straight in her stiff black hat, when she observed a tall man speaking to Lydia Harcourt outside the post office. By the time she reached the counter, she was fairly brimming with the news. "Quite the figure of a man," she announced loudly, so that not only Mr. Bowditch behind the scales, but also Miss Hartnell, Mrs. Clement, and the butcher's boy could hear. Dark hair, well-tailored coat, walked as if he owned the whole of St. Mary Mead, and there was Lydia Harcourt beside him, looking quite flushed. I tell you, it did not have the look of a mere errand. Miss Marple, who happened to be purchasing a jar of honey at that very moment, inclined her head politely and murmured something about the fine weather. She did not comment, for she had learned that to do so only diverted the flow of information. Sure enough, Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer, lowering her voice but not her eagerness. They say he is a business associate of John Harcourt's, though no one seems to know the particulars. Business associate, indeed.
Mark my words, there is more to it. Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered with interest, though her expression remained serene.
A business associate was a conveniently vague phrase, one that often concealed more than it revealed. She made no reply, but tucked the gossip away as she paid for her honey and stepped lightly out into the sunshine. The stranger's presence soon became a topic for the whole village. His name was Richard Ansell, so Lydia Harcourt explained when pressed, though her explanation was no more precise than her husband's. An associate from London,
helping with certain affairs. Richard Ansell was, it must be admitted, a handsome man.
He was tall, well-dressed, with dark eyes that lingered just long enough to flatter. He had a way of bowing his head to a lady in conversation that made her feel charming, even if she were merely ordering lamp oil. Yet, as Miss Marple observed during their first introduction at the Harcourts, there was also a slight hesitation when matters of money were mentioned. His gaze slid away, his hand adjusted his cuff, and he steered the talk to lighter topics with remarkable quickness. Such a pity, he had said to Miss Marple with a smile, that London cannot boast roses as fine as these.
I envy you your village gardens. London, Miss Marple replied, looking at him kindly, has its own roses, though of a rather different sort, don't you think?
For just an instant his eyes wavered, as though he had been caught out. Then he laughed smoothly, but the laugh rang a little too bright. Miss Marple, who had known young men who laughed to cover unease, filed it away. At the grocer's 2 mornings later, the whispers deepened. Mrs. Price Ridley, triumphant at having more news, declared she had seen Mr. Ansell walking with Lydia Harcourt along the lane that led toward the church. Not in the morning either, but near twilight, and she carried no basket, mind you, so it cannot have been her shopping errand.
I dare say it was not her husband she expected to meet in that direction.
Miss Hartnell pursed her lips, scandalized but secretly pleased. She is always dressed too smartly for my taste. Silk at luncheon, if you please. And now this. Mark my words, there will be trouble. Miss Marple, examining apples with great care, said nothing. But she reflected that Mrs. Harcourt's taste for fine clothes and her husband's known financial losses did not sit easily together. And when one added the presence of a stranger who appeared at twilight with her, the pattern became more intriguing still. That evening, Miss Marple took her usual walk along the village lanes, the air growing cooler as the sun sank. The hedgerows glowed gold, and the last swallows darted overhead. As she rounded a bend near the old oak, she saw 2 figures ahead. Lydia Harcourt and Richard Ansell stood close together, their heads bent in conversation. Lydia's cheeks were pink, though whether from the chill or the company one could not say. As Miss Marple approached with measured steps, Lydia gave a small laugh, too high, too hurried, and dropped her lace handkerchief. Richard Ansell stooped at once, picked it up, and returned it to her with a lingering pressure of the hand. Miss Marple, politely absorbed in adjusting her shawl, passed them with a gentle nod. "Good evening, Mrs. Harcourt, Mr. Ansell," Lydia started, then smiled too brightly.
Good evening, Miss Marple.
Such a lovely sunset. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and went on her way at her usual calm pace. Yet her eyes, sharp beneath the rim of her bonnet,
Missed nothing, the nervousness in Lydia's voice.
a slight tightening of Ansell's jaw later. When the lane was quiet again, Miss Marple returned by the same path. She had, she told herself, left her spectacles behind and wished to confirm it, though in truth she knew very well where her spectacles were. What she sought was something else entirely, and indeed, near the hedge where Lydia had stood, she found the handkerchief. It must have been dropped a second time, unnoticed in the dimness. Miss Marple lifted it delicately. The lace edge was fine, though slightly frayed. What caught her attention, however, was a faint smear of dark ink upon the corner. Not the smudge of careless penmanship, but the deep blot of a fountain pen pressed in haste. Miss Marple folded the handkerchief carefully, slipped it into her reticule, and resumed her walk with an expression of mild serenity. That night, seated by her fire with her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple considered what she had seen. A handsome stranger, vague about his business. A wife, pale and nervous beneath her social charm. A handkerchief stained with ink, though there had been no letter in sight. To anyone else it might appear only the flutterings of romance. But Miss Marple, who had observed too many human dramas unfold beneath the surface of small villages, knew better. She understood how easily the heart could lead to folly, and how swiftly folly could lead to something worse. She stirred her tea, the spoon clinking softly in the china. To the casual observer it was nothing at all, the narrator might have said. Yet Miss Marple knew that ink stains upon lace are seldom the mark of romance alone. Chapter 4. A letter. Gone missing, it began, as so many small mysteries in St. Mary Mead began, with a whispered confidence. Ellen, the Harcourt's young maid, found Miss Marple alone in the churchyard one morning, gathering a few late Michaelmas daisies for her mantelpiece. The girl came hurrying up, her cap askew and her face pale, and glanced nervously about before speaking. "Oh, Miss Marple."
"I do hope you won't think me forward," she said in a trembling voice, "but I don't know who else to tell."
"It's about a letter that's gone missing." "A letter for Mrs. Harcourt." Miss Marple looked at her with calm kindness, her hands still among the flowers.
"And what makes you so certain it has gone missing, my dear?"
Ellen swallowed.
"Because I saw it."
It was on the hall table, plain as could be, with Mrs. Harcourt's name in a fine hand. But later, when she asked for her post, it wasn't there.
"I swear I didn't touch it, Miss Marple."
"But I saw Mr. Harcourt looking at the letters just before, and now it's gone. If she thinks I mislaid it, well, it might be my place." The girl's eyes filled with anxious tears. Miss Marple, setting her daisies into her basket, patted Ellen's hand.
"There now, my dear, you mustn't distress yourself.
"Letters do sometimes go astray, quite innocently. Tell me, at what hour did you first notice it?"
"Just before luncheon, ma'am."
"And then again, well, it was gone not an hour later." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And was the handwriting familiar to you?" Ellen hesitated. It looked rather grand, if you don't mind my saying so. Not at all like the tradesmen's bills. More stylish, you might call it. Miss Marple's blue eyes rested on the girl for a moment, though her face was all sympathy. "Thank you, Ellen. You've done wisely to speak. These little things, you know, can sometimes matter a great deal." The maid gave a sigh of relief and hurried away. Miss Marple, left with her basket, walked slowly homeward. A missing letter, handled by the husband before it vanished, was not to be dismissed as mere carelessness. That evening brought choir practice at the church, a dependable fixture of village life. Miss Marple attended faithfully, not so much for her singing voice, which was serviceable at best, as for the pleasure of fellowship and, if truth be told, the small window it offered into her neighbours' lives. On this occasion, Lydia Harcourt was present. Usually she carried herself with composed grace, but tonight she seemed oddly unsettled. She turned the wrong page in her hymnal twice, prompting an exasperated glance from Miss Hartnell at her side, and she kept glancing over her shoulder toward the doorway, as though expecting, or perhaps dreading, someone's arrival. When they paused between verses, Mrs. Clement leaned toward Miss Marple with a murmur. "Poor Lydia, she looks quite flustered, don't you think?"
"I cannot recall her ever being so distracted before." Miss Marple inclined her head, watching as Lydia pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips.
"Yes," she said quietly. "Something does appear to weigh upon her." The hymn began again, the voices rising in harmony, yet Lydia's voice wavered, faltered, and finally fell silent altogether. after practice. As the singers gathered their coats, Dr. Graham lingered near Miss Marple. He was a kindly man, brisk in manner, but with a genuine fondness for his patients. "I say, Miss Marple," he remarked in a low tone, "I wish Harcourt would take a little more care of himself. His health is not as strong as it once was, though he won't hear a word of it, of course." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "Indeed. One might suppose Mrs. Harcourt would be anxious, then." The doctor's brow furrowed. "It is she I worry about, in truth. Strain is a most wearing thing, especially for a lady. She seems thinner of late," he broke off, then forced a lighter tone. "Still, these things may come right in time. One must hope so." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. She had noticed, as he spoke, that his gaze rested more on Lydia than on her husband when he spoke of concern. A subtle shift of sympathy, yet a telling one. The next day, Miss Marple set out for her usual errands in the High Street. As she approached the post office, she slowed her steps. There, just outside the doorway, stood Lydia Harcourt herself. She was not entering, only lingering, her eyes reddened as if she had been weeping. She clutched a folded paper in her hand, but made no move to post it. Mrs. Price Ridley, coming out with her stamps, gave Miss Marple a meaningful glance. "If you ask me," she whispered, "something's very wrong in that household."
A married woman with eyes like that? Not natural."
"I shouldn't wonder if there's some secret she's hiding." Miss Marple thanked her gently and moved on, but her mind was alert. Lydia, with reddened eyes, waiting outside the post office. Was she expecting a letter that had not arrived? Or had she discovered the loss of the one that Ellen had described? As Miss Marple passed, Lydia quickly slipped the folded paper into her reticule and forced a bright smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Such a fine day, isn't it?" "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied serenely. "And I hope, my dear, that you are keeping well." "Oh, perfectly," Lydia said too quickly. Perfectly well, but her hand, as she adjusted her glove, trembled unmistakably. That evening, in her quiet sitting room, with the clock ticking and the fire glowing, Miss Marple turned the day's events over in her mind. A vanished letter, a maid's fearful whisper, a wife unsettled at choir, a doctor's guarded remark, and Lydia's tears at the post office. All fragments, yet together they suggested a household under strain. Letters were curious things, Miss Marple reflected. They could carry affection or threat, news of fortune or ruin, and when such a letter disappeared, handled by the wrong hands, the consequences could be dire indeed. Miss Marple laid down her knitting, folded her spectacles, and allowed her gaze to rest on the fire. Miss Marple closed her knitting bag that night with the uneasy conviction that one letter,
unseen, could change the fate of an entire household.
Chapter 5. Shadows in the conservatory. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, naturally, who announced it first. She stood in the lane outside the grocer's, basket on her arm, and declared to anyone within earshot that the Harcourts were to host a musical evening in their grand conservatory. "Well," she sniffed, "I cannot think what possessed them. Music in a glass-house of all places.
One would swelter to death, I should imagine."
But of course Lydia Harcourt is fond of displaying her orchids. Perhaps she thinks the notes will improve their growth." Miss Marple, who was behind her in the queue for butter, smiled serenely and made no comment. Yet she noted the little gleam of relish in Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes. Concerts, after all, brought people together, and when people gathered, truths often peeked through the most polite of curtains. The evening of the concert proved fine, with a soft September dusk laying pale gold across the lawns. The conservatory glowed from within, its glass panes shining like lanterns. Guests drifted up the gravel path in their evening clothes, voices subdued in anticipation. Miss Marple, wrapped in her neat shawl, arrived punctually. She was greeted warmly by Lydia, who looked charming in pale silk, though there was a faint flush upon her cheeks even then. Mr. Harcourt, broad-shouldered in his dinner jacket, offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said in a tone of practised geniality. "You are most welcome. A little culture for the village, eh? Though I hope the acoustics will serve." "They usually do," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Music is often most revealing in enclosed spaces." Mr. Harcourt gave a short laugh and ushered her inside. The conservatory had been transformed with rows of chairs set among tall palms and flowering orchids.
Lamps glowed softly, their light reflecting on glass and polished leaves.
At the front, a small string quartet tuned their instruments. The air held a faint, exotic perfume of blossoms. Miss Marple took her seat beside Mrs. Clement, who whispered behind her programme. "It is kind of them, of course, but I cannot help feeling it is rather showy, and Mr. Harcourt is not usually one for music. He prefers cigars, I dare say." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Cigars, yes. They often leave their trace in unexpected corners." Mrs. Clement looked puzzled, but before she could inquire, the music began. The quartet played with spirit, filling the conservatory with lively notes. Guests tapped their programmes, smiled, and murmured polite admiration. Yet Miss Marple, ever observant, rose quietly during one piece and slipped into the adjoining passage. The corridor was dim, lined with tall windows opening onto the garden. One such window stood slightly ajar, its latch unfastened. Miss Marple touched it gently, noting the cool draught upon her fingers. It was curious that such a window should be left unsecured on a night when the house was full of guests. She lifted her head and sniffed the air delicately. Yes, there it was again, the lingering scent of cigar smoke, not the faintest trace, but fresh enough to suggest that someone had stood there not long ago. And Mr. Harcourt, she recalled, had been seated prominently in the front row when she left the conservatory. When Miss Marple returned, the music was ending. Lydia Harcourt stood at the side, fanning herself with unnecessary vigour. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "My dear," exclaimed Miss Hartnell, bustling over, "how very warm you look! But I find it most cool in here. Quite delightful, in fact. Do you?" Lydia laughed a little too quickly.
"Perhaps it is only me."
"The lamps, you know, they throw off such heat." Miss Marple seated herself quietly, but she noted how Lydia's hand trembled slightly as she set aside her fan. During the interval, trays of lemonade and sherry circulated. Guests mingled among the orchids, admiring rare blooms. Colonel Weston, inspecting a cymbidium, muttered to Miss Marple, "Dashed fine affair this, though I hear Harcourt has been stretching himself. Not wise, these extravagances, when one has had poor luck in certain investments." Miss Marple sipped her sherry. "Extravagance is often most curious when paired with economy in other matters," she said softly. The Colonel grunted. "Quite so. A man may host concerts while his creditors wait at the door. That, at least, has been done before." Later in the evening, a small commotion arose near one of the tall curtains at the rear of the conservatory. A servant, pale with distress, had discovered a valuable vase overturned upon the carpet. Fortunately, it had not broken, though the orchids it had contained lay scattered. "Oh, careless boy!" Mr. Harcourt exclaimed irritably. "Must you stumble about like an ox among glass?" The footman stammered apologies, but Miss Marple, glancing at the scene, noticed something most curious. Upon the carpet, near the place where the vase had fallen, was the distinct impression of a man's shoe. Not the soft tread of a servant, but the heavier print of an outdoor sole. Miss Marple said nothing. She only bent, as if to retrieve her knitting bag from beneath her chair, and observed the angle of the mark. Someone had stood there deliberately, hidden behind the curtain, hidden while music played and guests applauded. As the evening wore on, the quartet concluded with a stirring piece. Guests applauded, voices rose in praise, and Lydia Harcourt laughed rather too loudly at a remark from Richard Ansell, who had appeared at her side with suspicious punctuality. Miss Marple, watching from across the room, saw how Lydia's laughter ended abruptly when her husband's gaze fell upon her. The colour drained a little from her cheeks, She turned quickly to the orchids, remarking on their fragrance. A change of manner, slight yet undeniable. When at last the guests departed, the conservatory still glowed with lamplight, but the scattered petals on the carpet told their silent tale. Miss Marple walked home beneath the stars. Her steps measured, her mind occupied. An unlatched window, the scent of cigar smoke, a flushed hostess protesting of heat where others felt coolness, a vase overturned, and the imprint of a man's shoe. All were small things, easily overlooked amid music and laughter, yet together they formed a shadow across the evening's gaiety. And in that overturned vase Miss Marple read the first sure sign of danger creeping into the Harcourt's home. Chapter 6. The night by the churchyard, it was the vicar's wife who first remarked, over her morning tea, that evenings were never quite as quiet as one supposed in St. Mary Mead. She told Mrs. Price Ridley that only the other night she had heard voices near the churchyard gate, low, urgent voices most unsuitable for such a sacred spot. Mrs. Price Ridley naturally repeated the tale with embellishment, suggesting that such whispering must involve romance, or worse. For who, she declared, has on his business loitering among gravestones at dusk, unless, of course, one wishes to keep from prying eyes. Miss Marple, listening with mild interest as she selected her potatoes in the grocer's, made no outward comment. Yet her mind, as sharp as the knife the grocer used to trim cabbages, was already considering the matter carefully, for she herself had observed the quiet comings and goings by the churchyard path, and she had formed the habit, of late, of taking her own evening constitutional that way. The air was still when Miss Marple set out that evening, shawl about her shoulders, her step unhurried. The churchyard lay bathed in twilight, the old stones casting long shadows across the grass. To a casual passer-by it seemed a place of peace, but Miss Marple, with her quick eyes, noticed at once the two figures standing near the lych gate. It was Lydia Harcourt and Richard Ansell. They were close together, speaking in hushed voices, their faces partially turned away. Miss Marple slowed, pausing beside a yew, as if to admire the mossy carving on a headstone. From there, she observed without seeming to watch. Lydia's hands were clasped before her, twisting her handkerchief. Ansell leaned nearer, his expression intent, his voice low but charged. Then Miss Marple saw him press something small into Lydia's hand. In the dim light it caught a glimmer, round, delicate. A locket, perhaps, or some token. Lydia glanced about nervously before slipping it into her reticule. Miss Marple, serenely turning to continue her walk, made no sign that she had noticed, but in her heart she marked the scene with quiet precision. Lovers' trinkets exchanged by a churchyard wall seldom bode well when there is already unrest within a marriage. The next morning brought a disturbance of quite a different nature. As Miss Marple stepped into her garden to deadhead the roses, she heard raised tones from the Harcourt's direction. The study windows were flung open to the September air, and Mr. Harcourt's voice carried with startling clarity. "Betrayal, I say."
"Do you take me for a fool? Ruin is what you brought upon us. Ruin."
The words rang out, sharp and bitter, before being muffled as the window was slammed shut. Miss Marple stood very still among her roses, the secateurs poised in her hand. She reflected, not without pity, that domestic quarrels have a way of echoing louder than their participants intend, especially when pride is wounded. That afternoon, as she sat in the tea-shop with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife leaned close, lowering her voice. "It is most peculiar, Miss Marple. Lydia Harcourt has not been seen all day, not in the High Street, not at choir practice, not even calling upon the sick, as she so often does."
"People are already talking." Mrs. Price Ridley, seated at the next table with her currant bun, pricked up her ears instantly.
"Disappeared, has she? Well, I should not be surprised. A woman does not vanish from view without a reason. Mark my words, it is either scandal or shame." Miss Marple poured her tea with steady hand, her expression mild. Absence is often more telling than presence, my dear Mrs. Price Ridley.
A lady may be unwell, or she may indeed have cause to avoid the eyes of her neighbours. Mrs. Clement gave a troubled sigh. It is not like Lydia. I do hope, it is nothing serious. Miss Marple stirred her cup gently.
She had noticed, with her habitual keen eye, the faint reddening about Mrs. Clement's ears, a sure sign of worry suppressed in the interest of propriety. The day wore on, and still no sign of Lydia. The Harcourt house stood with its blinds drawn halfway, as though uncertain whether to admit light or keep it out. Mr. Harcourt was seen striding down the lane, his expression thunderous, while Richard Ansell passed through the village with an air of studied nonchalance, pausing to tip his hat to the ladies, though avoiding any prolonged conversation about business. Miss Marple, seated later on her porch with her knitting, allowed her needles to click softly, while her thoughts moved more swiftly than her hands betrayed. She remembered the glint of the locket in Lydia's hand, the fury in Harcourt's voice, and now the unexplained absence. All were pieces of a pattern, though the picture was not yet fully clear. It was often so, Miss Marple reflected. One must wait, as one waits for a storm to break, listening to the stillness before the rain. That evening, the bells tolled softly for evensong. Their sound drifted over gardens and cottages, echoing among the gravestones of the churchyard. Villagers walked sedately to service, but Miss Marple remained at her porch, knitting folded in her lap. She gazed toward the church, her expression calm yet inwardly alert. For she knew as surely as the sky held gathering clouds that this quiet would not last. The whispered voices by the churchyard gate, the tokens exchanged, the furious words carried through an open window, all were warnings. And that evening, as the bells tolled, Miss Marple foresaw that the quiet of the churchyard would soon be shattered by something far more sinister. Chapter 7. A death in the drawing-room. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, as so often, who carried the news first. She appeared on the high street that morning with her hat askew and her shawl half-fastened, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Harcourt is gone," she announced, breathless, to anyone within range. Dead in his own drawing-room, no less. They say it was his heart, though I cannot help but wonder. A man does not shout about betrayal one day and fall down lifeless the next without some cause behind it. Within the hour, every doorstep and shop counter in some merry Mead was buzzing. Some spoke of grief, some of providence, and some of scandal, but all agreed that such a thing was bound to stir the village for weeks to come. Miss Marple, receiving the tidings from the postmistress with her usual calm, merely folded her hands upon her reticule. "Ah," she said quietly, "the drawing-room is not always the most restful of places. People so often think it is." At Harcourt House, blinds were drawn, and the air was heavy with whispers. The doctor had come, his bag carried solemnly, and officials were murmuring together in the hall. Miss Marple, under pretext of calling upon Lydia, was admitted by the trembling maid Ellen, whose face was pale and eyes red. "Oh,
Miss Marple," she whispered, as she led her down the passage. "'Tis dreadful, simply dreadful."
"They say it was his heart, but—" She broke off, glancing about, then lowered her voice. "There's things not right, if you ask me."
"I saw with my own eyes." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring pat. "Courage, child."
"These matters have a way of finding the light." The drawing-room itself bore the stillness of shock. Mr. Harcourt lay in his chair, his head fallen to one side, his complexion oddly waxen. On the small table beside him stood a glass of brandy, full to the brim and untouched. The room smelled faintly of cigars, though the ashtray was curiously empty. Miss Marple's eyes, gentle though unyielding, took in every detail. She noticed the faint powdery film along the rim of the glass, so faint that most would never have seen it. Powder and brandy were seldom companions. Lydia Harcourt, her face blotched from weeping, sat upon the sofa with a handkerchief crushed in her hand.
"It is unbearable, Miss Marple," she sobbed as soon as she entered. "To be taken so suddenly.
And only yesterday he seemed so strong." Her words were sincere enough, but her tone carried a faintly rehearsed note, as though each phrase had been considered in advance. Miss Marple, settling herself with her knitting, inclined her head sympathetically. "You were not with him at the time?"
she asked gently. "No, no, indeed." Lydia's eyes darted.
"I was calling upon Mrs. Clement in the evening. She will tell you so herself." It was said too quickly, with a firmness that suggested forethought. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, allowed the statement to pass without challenge. Later that afternoon, Richard Ansell arrived. He came with flowers and words of condolence, his handsome face arranged into an expression of appropriate sorrow. Yet when he spoke, his voice quivered oddly. Not with grief, but with something closer to unease. "Terrible loss, terrible," he said. "I cannot express how deeply I sympathize with Mrs. Harcourt. Harcourt was a man of strength, of great character. We are all diminished." Miss Marple watched him closely. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he placed the flowers in a vase. Trembled not with sorrow, she thought, but with the strain of maintaining a part. It was Ellen, the maid, who brought the most disquieting whisper. She sought Miss Marple out in the hallway, her voice low and urgent. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but I must speak. Last night, before it happened, I saw Mrs. Harcourt near the study door. She was pale as death, and when she saw me, she near jumped out of her skin. She hurried away without a word, and then not an hour later, this." The girl wrung her hands. "They'll say I'm slandering my mistress, but I know what I saw." Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "It is seldom slander, my dear, to speak what one has observed. Truth is a shy thing, but it leaves footprints if one is willing to look. By evening, the village was in uproar. At the Bluebird tea rooms, Miss Hartnell declared that Lydia's fainting fits were all too convenient, while Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she had always suspected a hidden temper in Harcourt, and that sudden death was likely no accident. The Colonel muttered darkly about investments gone wrong, and Dr. Graham, pressed for his opinion, said only, "The heart can fail under many strains." Miss Marple listened without correction, pouring her tea with delicate precision. She noticed how the talk circled always back to Lydia, as if the village had already chosen its culprit. And yet her eyes grew thoughtful behind her spectacles. Matters in St. Mary Mead were never so simple as the first telling. That night, in her quiet sitting room, Miss Marple considered all she had seen. An untouched glass of brandy, a powdery rim, a widow too eager with her alibi, a young man whose voice quivered, and a maid's frightened confession. Each piece suggested guilt, yet guilt was seldom so neatly arrayed. Her needles clicked rhythmically as the fire crackled. She reflected that truth often lay not in the loud declarations of innocence or grief, but in the small inconsistencies, the things left unsaid, the tremor of a hand upon a flower vase, and so, with her shawl tucked about her shoulders, she allowed the night to draw in, her mind alert even as her body rested, for she knew that in St. Mary Mead nothing is ever as straightforward as it first appears. Chapter 8. The Affair. Unmasked. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, of course, who remarked that she had always said there was something odd about that Mr. Ansell. She declared it to Mrs. Hartnell at the greengrocer's, her voice carrying over the turnips and carrots, so that the errand boy and a pair of farmers both paused to listen. "A man who smiles too much."
"I've never trusted," she announced, adjusting her gloves with a self-satisfied air.
"And his hair, too carefully brushed for my liking. Mark my words, I always thought there would be revelations." That morning, the village buzzed like a hive, each house producing its own version of the Harcourt tragedy. Yet none guessed the truth, which was quietly knitting itself together in Miss Marple's mind, stitch by careful stitch. The vicarage drawing-room was warm with lamplight and the faint scent of polished wood. Outside, twilight softened the gardens, but inside a cluster of villagers gathered with the anticipation of an audience awaiting a tale. Lydia sat pale and drawn, her hands twisting a crumpled handkerchief, while Dr. Graham stood by the fireplace, his brow knit in anxious lines. The vicar and his wife hovered, offering tea and comfort, and Richard Ansell himself, summoned with polite insistence, maintained a show of injured innocence, though his eyes never quite met Miss Marple's. Miss Marple herself was serene. She sat near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, a pot of tea steaming on the table beside her. Her expression was mild, but her blue eyes, sharp and unerring, moved from face to face with quiet consideration. "It has been suggested," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle, as though she were merely discussing parish roses, "that Mr. Harcourt's death was sudden, yet natural, a heart complaint perhaps. Others have hinted at domestic discord, and poor Mrs. Harcourt has borne the brunt of that suspicion." Lydia gave a faint sob, quickly stifled, and Miss Marple glanced at her kindly. "But," she continued, "when one looks closely, the matter arranges itself differently. The room seemed to lean in. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, perched on the edge of her chair, held her tongue for once. The letter that went missing," Miss Marple said, her needles keeping their rhythm, "was no billet doux at all, though many assumed so. It was a blackmail note, clumsy in wording, but effective. Someone had discovered a fear in Mrs. Harcourt's past and meant to profit from it. A stir ran through the company."
Lydia lifted her head, her lips parting in shock. "It was not," Miss Marple said gently, "a matter of romantic indiscretion, but of money. A small inheritance that had once been in question, enough to make a lady nervous and a scoundrel greedy. Mr. Ansell, I believe, was the hand behind it." All eyes turned.
Richard Ansell laughed, too loudly, too heartily. "Really, Miss Marple, this is monstrous. To accuse me—" "Monstrous, perhaps," Miss Marple agreed serenely, "but true." She set down her knitting and folded her hands. "Mr. Harcourt discovered the fraud. He was not a gentleman, as we know, and his temper was quick. He threatened exposure. But in doing so, he offered precisely the opportunity his enemy desired." Her gaze rested quietly on Ansell. "The powder upon the rim of the brandy glass was no accident, a little too much for the faint disguise of dust. It matched certain substances found in your own case, Mr. Ansell, and you counted, did you not, upon Mrs. Harcourt's distress to divert attention from yourself?"
Ansell's face paled, the bravado slipping from him like a mask abandoned after a play.
His fingers twitched at his cuffs, and he said nothing. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a little gasp.
"I knew it."
"I said so to Mrs. Hartnell only yesterday. Too much cologne. Always the sign of a deceiver." Dr. Graham coughed into his hand, but his eyes were fixed steadily on Lydia, whose shoulders had begun to shake with silent relief. "The vase behind the curtain," Miss Marple went on, her voice steady, "was no accident of careless servants. It was overturned in haste by a man seeking concealment, while voices and music covered his movements. The shoe marks upon the carpet were too large for Ellen and too heavy for Mrs. Harcourt. No, they were a man's." Lydia lifted her face then, her eyes red, but her voice clear.
"I never wished harm to my husband."
"Heaven knows we were not happy, but I never sought his death. The letter frightened me beyond sense, and I was ashamed. That is why I said nothing." "But I swear to you," Miss Marple nodded kindly. "No one here doubts you now, my dear. Blackmail preys upon silence. It was your very silence that Mr. Ansell relied upon." The vicar's wife laid a gentle hand upon Lydia's arm. "You are among friends, Mrs. Harcourt. The truth clears away many shadows." At last the constable, summoned quietly by Dr. Graham, stepped forward. His manner was respectful but firm as he took hold of Ansell's arm. There was no struggle, only a collapse of arrogance, a man undone by his own scheming. The villagers watched in hushed astonishment as he was led away. Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes gleamed with vindication, though even she found no immediate words. Only the clock upon the mantel ticked with calm indifference. When the door closed and quiet settled, Miss Marple reached once more for her knitting. "And so," she said softly, "the matter is at an end. A sad affair, but one that might have been far worse, had silence prevailed." She poured herself another cup of tea, steam curling in the lamplight, and smiled faintly as she drew the yarn through her fingers. And so the affair that had set tongues wagging and placed Miss Marple herself amid whispers of danger was brought to its end. Yet as she folded her knitting, Miss Marple smiled, knowing that in every village lane and teacup lies a story waiting for the watchful eye to uncover.